I swear to God, kid, you're going nowhere. You abuse me, I'll laugh. You kill me, I'll be your ghost. You hate me, I'll still love you. You run away, I'll chase you. You hide, I'll hunt you down. Only I'll own you. I'm too in love with you and too obsessed with you and crazy about you, baby. When you're dealing with messages like that, someone that's so sick and twisted, you know it's a dangerous person.
You guys right? You got everything?
Yeah.
Drinks. Okay. God, I had Renee. I was married at 19, had Renee straight away, Mark. My name is Teresa Marsden. I'm Renee's mum. I live here with my husband, Mark.
Luke, when you get your bit of that moustache, mate, it looks good. Oh, okay.
I have 3 other children, Luke, Jake, and Monique.
That was 6 days for the trip.
We live on 5 acres, about 20 minutes out of Sydney. Yeah, it's like a little country town, I suppose. Renee was my best friend. You know, being a young mum, we did everything together. She just lit up the room. Her infectious smile, her laugh, she was like a spark. Renee was like a little princess. She was tiny, so the higher the shoes, the better they were. She probably would have had about easy 100 pair of shoes. Every colour, every style, she had them. Loved shoes.
I'm Mark Marsden and I'm Renee's father. Renee was a lovely girl. Renee was very bright, bubbly, affectionate, a real family girl. Very friendly, everyone liked Renee.
In 2010, Renee was 18. Probably the happiest I've ever seen Renee. Everything was coming together for her.
When I first met Renee, I just joined the Australian Army in the infantry. I required a haircut. I went into a hair salon called Miss Elizabeth's Hair Salon, which, unbeknown to me, was where Renee Marsden was working. And I was blown away from the first sight by her beauty. I completely fell head over heels for it. And I eventually built up the will to ask her out on a date once I found out she was single. She had an infectious, beautiful smile and a very caring, very loving person. Always put others before herself in every aspect. We were both completely infatuated with each other. We really, truly did love each other. The plans were to settle down, buy a property, get married, have kids, and really just live our lives to the fullest together with each other.
Renee and I were extremely close. We grew up only 6 months apart. She was my best friend. We did everything together. Camilla was Renee's best friend during high school. They met, I think it was in year 8. They had started to form a pretty close friendship and do a lot of things together.
One day, Renee came up to me with her phone in her hand, and on her phone was a supposed message from myself to my friend Jamie, who was second cousins with Camilla, showing that I had just planned to sleep with Renee and cheat on her, and that she wasn't anything significant to me. She naturally was very upset, but I was never unfaithful. I was actually quite baffled to how we were in such deep love one day, and a matter of weeks later, we were separated. We were broken up. The 2 years I spent with Renee were the best years of my life. I was quite distraught. It was quite a heavy thing to deal with. I never saw it coming. I knew something just wasn't right, something was up.
When Renee and Angus broke up, for weeks after, Renee was quite distraught. Then one day, she said to me, "Mum, Camilla's introduced me to somebody." I said, "Oh, okay, who?" And she said, "Well, he's her ex-boyfriend." And at the time, I went, "Whoa, you know, like, Renee, you don't cross that line. That's, he's your friend's ex. You don't do that." And she said, no, Camilla said it's all good. She said, and they were talking via text, Camilla had given him her number and he had introduced himself and said he's Braden. I was happy for them just to text, to be honest with you. I thought that's how they'll start, you know, speaking and how the relationship will start. Renee showed me a photo of Braden. He was actually with Camilla and she had a head on his shoulder. He was a quite handsome looking guy. He seemed nice. So Renee told me that Braden was 23. He went to King's School, quite a prestigious boys' school in the area. His family had a construction company and he was set to take over the family empire. After Renee had met Braden, the text messages just went through the roof. She never went anywhere without that mobile phone. It was always buzzing, like to the extent I'd say, "Renee, who could be texting you so many times a day?" It was relentless. There was a sense of excitement. Someone new, he was older, he seemed more mature. She said to me, "Mum, it's like he wants what I want in life. He's telling me, like, everything that I've always wanted, he wants the same." It was music to her ears. Renee was desperate to meet up with him. And every time she asked to meet him, he was busy with Dad's business. It was Christmas time as well. There was always an excuse. We went on a family cruise to the South Pacific over the Christmas break for 2 weeks. It was a great time. She had no contact with the outside world. As you do on a cruise, you don't get any reception, so it was amazing, absolutely amazing. Then about a week after we got back from the cruise, Renee came to me and told me that Camilla had messaged her and said that Braden was involved in a motorcycle accident and his best friend Richie was riding on the back, and Richie was actually killed in the accident and Braden was being charged with manslaughter. So you've been taken to jail. Renee was devastated. A young guy involved in a motorcycle accident, you wouldn't wish it upon anybody. I mean, he's been charged now for his friend's murder. I felt sorry for him. I really did.
Goulburn prison is a maximum security prison, about an hour and a half's drive from Sydney. It is a prison for some of the worst criminals in Australia.
I did say to Renee, well, shall we go see him? Because she was quite upset. She'd never met this guy. Camilla said to Renee that no, he wasn't allowed to have visitors because he's foregoing his visiting rights for a shorter sentence. So he'll be out in 2 years. I didn't think that there was going to be any more texting. That was it. But Camilla told Renee that she had smuggled a phone into prison so he could continue messaging her. He said he could never speak.
Braden could only text back because if anyone had heard him on the phone, he would be in a lot of trouble and it would prolong his sentence.
So we thought, well, okay, he's come from a wealthy family. They've paid off someone. He's managed to get a phone in jail, and that was it. So they both kept messaging each other. He told her everything about his family, his feelings, his vulnerability, and she was attracted to that.
In one way or another, we got to know the whole family, and that whole family had a story.
He felt a lot of guilt over Richie's death.
Braden had a brother with Braden tattooed on his arm.
His mother had a brain tumour, and she was dying in hospital.
When Renee first told me the whole story, the first expression I said was like, let that go. Who would want to be involved with that? Particularly at such a young age, like she owed him nothing. But Renee was so keen to remain in the relationship that she had even given Braden access to her Facebook, her passwords. So she's having conversations here with Braden about stuff, saying, 1,000 angels dance around you, I am complete now that I found you. Straight away, Braden, posing as Renee, using her account, says, I love you, Nay, you're the only angel. Renee then using her own account says, oh, so much of a cutie. Then she replies again saying, I love you, Bray. You can really tell that Renee's head over heels for Braden. She loves him, she wants nothing more than to be with him. You know, at the end of the day, I think all she could think about was Braden because he was everywhere. Phone, computer, laptops, like no matter where she went, he was there.
I wasn't happy at all. I was not happy because I thought, here's this young girl full of life, full of energy, and she was wasting her time on someone who was in prison.
My name is Martha Thomas. I am a close friend of Renee's mother, Teresa Marston. I was also a good friend with Renee Marston. Around August 2012, Camilla asked to join our soccer team.
We played every Sunday. Renee always came and watched me play.
Camilla, she was friendly. She was actually pretty good, scoring all the goals for us.
She looked like a really changed person. She wasn't this aggressive person that I had known. Camilla and Renee both went to Mount St Benedict Catholic Girls High School. In Year 9, Camilla became quite obsessive of Renee. Renee had a huge circle of friends, and when Camilla came onto the scene, she took complete control over Renee of who her friends were and how much access she had to them.
My relationship with Renee definitely deteriorated. She didn't want to do anything with me anymore.
I actually found love letters written by Camilla. I was shocked. I thought it was by mail, to be honest with you.
When I first met Renee, Camilla used to call Renee and message her constantly to find out where she's at. Was she with me? What are we doing? But Camilla got the message loud and clear that I wasn't going anywhere, and she did back off.
So she started to become good friends with Renee again. Over the months with Renee and Braden texting each other, it became quite obvious that he was starting to take more control over her life. She didn't really go out as much. She became more isolated. Braden was using up most of Renee's time through text message. The phone never went anywhere with. She never went anywhere without that phone. The phone was always attached to her.
On New Year's Eve night 2012, Renee and I decided that we wanted to go to the Ivy nightclub in Sydney. She bought a really nice red dress, as you can see, and I just had a white dress, and we took a fair few selfies. We had sent a couple of photos to some of my friends. She had sent a couple to Braden. We thought he was going to respond complimenting her. We were dancing, we were enjoying the DJ. All of a sudden, there's a couple of messages Renee receives from Brayden. She looked like a tart and only sluts wore stuff like that. She was going to cheat on him. We were going to get unwanted attention. It was a bombardment of messages. And it got to the point where, you know, every 5 minutes, Renee was on her phone. So I said to her, like, get off the phone, you're ruining the night. Like, enjoy the moment. It sort of all happened around midnight. Renee got a message from Angus.
I texted Renee telling her that I was happy to take things at a slow pace, that I still did love her, and I didn't want to pressure her into anything she didn't want to do.
Renee messaged Camilla about it, and Camilla had straight away saying, like, why did you message Angus? Stop cheating on Brayden. You told me you don't speak to Angus anymore. A couple of hours later, Renee gets a message from Brayden, more or less saying that why does she lie to him, that she's a cheater, that she's messaging Angus, she's still seeing Angus behind everyone's back, you know, that Camilla had done the right thing. He was always very much making Renee feel guilty about things, sort of. She was always being belittled. He made her feel small. It was emotional abuse in one way with how he spoke to her. From a young age, Renee was very family orientated.
She always wanted to be a young mum, married around the same time as myself. So towards probably about March, April 2013, Brayden was always going to be released. And every time Renee questioned that, it was like, it's going to be soon, it's going to be soon. And at the final point, it was, Renee, I'm definitely going to be released by the time it's your 21st birthday. His release date was going to be in October and they will be married. I didn't like it. I didn't like it one bit. I thought he was selfish. I thought, how dare you, you're trapping my daughter. I didn't want him for her.
Renee's plans to get married to Brayden, I think, were one of, to me, horror. My family and her family would never accept him, and she more or less just said that, oh well, so be it, she would choose Brayden over the family.
He asked her to go out and start organising everything for their wedding. And at that point, she found a tiara in a jewellery store in Sydney. She organised a wedding photographer. And she actually wrote an email to the Greek consulate asking if he could be allowed into the country because he's got a criminal record, because they want a honeymoon there. I couldn't understand, to be honest with you, how she could marry someone like that and allow him to treat her that way and then still have feelings, like still be in love with someone like that.
In June 2013, we were playing soccer. Renee and Camilla's friend Melanie were watching from sideline. And Camilla scored a goal when we came off the field. Camilla was very angry towards Renee and Melanie because they were chatting, they missed her goal. That was a big moment because Renee decided not to come to soccer anymore.
And at that point, Renee sent Camilla a text message saying that she no longer wanted to be friends with her. And then Camilla sent Renee a text message asking if she would be coming to watch our game. And Renee responded, no. The only way I'm going to come to watch you guys play is if Mum wins the World Cup. Camilla at that point realised Renee wasn't mucking around anymore and she was serious. The friendship was over. Monday afternoon, Renee came home from work. And then I got a text message from Braden. He said, you need to sort your daughter out. She's threatening to kill herself. I answered him, I said, why would she be threatening to kill herself? He said, you're her mother, why don't you ask her that? So I sat beside her on the bed and I said, should I be concerned? I said, have a look at this. And she looked at my phone and she said to me, don't be stupid, Mum. She said, I wouldn't do anything like that. She said, you've got nothing to worry about, Mum. She said, I found out what he's all about. She said, it's over. Deep down, I was so relieved. I thought, thank God. I'm so happy that it's finally over and now she can move on with her life. So I had no concerns. I thought, no, she's not unstable. She's not in that frame of mind. I'm not concerned. And I said to her, what are you doing, Renee? And she said, I'm going to go out with the guys from work. So she's putting her makeup on. She's standing in front of the mirror and she was doing her hair, and I said to her, why didn't you leave? I said, why don't you leave your hair down, Renee? You're so pretty. You got beautiful hair. Leave your hair down. She said, oh, Mum, no, it's okay. It's dirty. I'm just going to put it up in a bun. I said, okay. She said, Mum, you don't have to worry. I won't be late. I got that message, and her first opening line, I think it was, please forgive me, Mum. You're my best friend. She was, even at that point, she wasn't concerned about herself. She always put people first. My first instinct was, she needs to talk to me. I never thought anything other than that. I rang her a few times, she wouldn't answer the phone, and then I sent her a message saying, please answer your phone. And I got nothing. I made a phone call to Camilla asking her, has she heard from Renee? And Camilla said, yes, why? I said, well, Renee's not answering her phone, she's missing. What did she say to you? And she said, oh, well, she said that she loved me and she was sorry. And she said, don't worry, Teresa, I'm going to help you find her. Let's go looking for her. All the places I know she would be. I thought, okay, let's go. And she said, let's go to McDonald's, because Renee and I often went to McDonald's and it's just around the corner. So we went to McDonald's and she wasn't there. And then she took me to a house and I said, who lives here? And she said, well, this is Braden's sister. And I went to get out and she said, her car's not here, she's not here, so we left. We just looked everywhere, everywhere. I just prayed that I would find her. We came home and the police came to us about 9 o'clock or 9:30 that night.
They came in, sat Teresa and I down, and they told us that they'd found Renee's car at Watson's Bay, the Gap, but they hadn't located her.
Everyone knows the Gap as not just a beautiful place, but a place that people go and take their life.
Hopefully she hadn't have done it, and hopefully she was still alive. We drove down there to see what we could do or see what we could find.
We didn't know where to start. The Gap's a big place. The police told us to wait, and I wasn't waiting. I wanted to find her. There was no stopping me. And it wasn't long up the pathway where it's like a big turret. I saw a pair of black flat shoes. I thought to myself, oh my God, why would she take her shoes off?
It was at that point that we realised that this was our worst case scenario. This could have happened. A feeling of absolute devastation.
They wouldn't let me go any further. They sectioned off the area and they told me to go home.
I got the impression that they were virtually saying to us, you should go home and start preparing for a funeral.
Everyone was here. Mum, Dad, my sisters, nieces, everybody, including Camilla. And she sat with us and told me that Braden was hurting. He was hurting as much as what we are.
Camilla came up to me and she asked me, do you think Renee's actually done it? And I remember just thinking, well, what do you think? Like, you tell me first. And she was like, well, she's an attention seeker. I don't think she's done it. I think she's run away. And then I was like, oh, okay, that's a bit strange. And I asked her if I could see the last message that she had received from Renee. And Camilla told me that she had accidentally gone to screenshot it, yet managed to delete it. I remember thinking, how abnormal is that? Like, how do you mistake a screenshot for deleting a message?
The police did a very thorough search and there were no signs of the body, no signs of any clothing, no signs of anything. The best advice we had on that was the body was washed out to sea with currents. In the immediate days after the search was called off, we then started to try and understand what had caused Renee to end up at the Gap. The police didn't see this as anything other than a suicide. It was us that was putting the jigsaw puzzle together. All roads led to Braden. We wanted to talk to him. Teresa wanted answers, so did I. We wanted to meet with him. Camilla became very reluctant to discuss any aspects of Braden. So we started to look at Renee, Camilla and Braden's phone records and via the invoicing from the phone company. It'll have the message and the time that that message was sent and who it was sent to. I broke it down into colours, so when Camilla is talking to others, that was in the brown. When Braden is talking to Renee, that was in green. And when Camilla was talking to Renee, that's in blue. And I didn't just chart 1 day or 2 days, I charted weeks. And what it shows you is that everything is in groups. At no stage does Braden come in between a dialogue between Camilla and Renee, and nor does Camilla come in between a conversation between Braden and Renee. This is not normal. We don't ever see Camilla talking to Renee and Braden talking to Renee at the same time. In any dialogue, you'd expect to find it a bit more fragmented, but you don't see that. You see chunks. At this point in time, it became pretty clear to me that this is not two different people. This, in fact, is the one person oscillating between her private phone and the phone she's using as Braden to Renee. I then sent this information to the police, And then the police came back within 2 or 3 days and said that, "You're probably right, Mark."
When police examined the text messages, they noticed that none of them were originating from down here in Goulburn, which is where Braden Spiteri was apparently in jail. The messages being sent by Braden were coming from up here near Glenhaven. They were pinging off the same tower as Camilla's messages were pinging off.
That was a game changer, because at that point we knew 100% that Camilla was in fact Braden.
Police called Goulburn Prison, but of course immediately they were assured there was no Braden Spiteri in the system.
I was so angry. I was so angry. I thought, how could someone be so cruel, so mean? You know, she came into my home, we treated her well, and then to deceive and be so evil. Braden manipulated Renee as well as Camilla. So she had it from her best friend and she had it from her boyfriend. They had total control over her. I hated her, absolutely hated her. Despised her.
We even chucked so many.
It's all been a game to her. Like a chessboard, and she played us. She played the lot of us.
From my perspective, he was always real.
Even now we still look at it, like when we speak about it now, I still speak about Braden and Camilla. I don't say Camilla.
So I think in hindsight, the biggest things that I noticed was that Camilla and Braden were using the same grammar and punctuation. They used the same phrases. They both spelt my name with a double E.
It was elaborate, it was extensive, it was well thought out and well executed, and we all got conned.
The truth is that Camilla was constantly wearing down Renee's mental state and convincing her that I wasn't the right person for her. If Camilla wasn't ever on the scenes, I do believe we would have married, have kids, and lived together with each other.
The police interviewed a guy called Joseph who worked at the same courier company as Renee. Joseph said that on Renee's final day, about 1 p.m, we walked up the road to get coffee, and just prior to getting to the shop, Renee received a text message on her phone, and after reading it, she began to cry. She was shaking and her face went red. Renee held out her phone and I saw a text message which read, "I think I need a break, and so do you." We then arrived at the cafe and Renee was crying so much that the waiter brought out some napkins and Renee used them to wipe her tears. Renee called Goulburn Prison at 2:44. We don't know exactly what she learnt, but it was likely that there was no Braden Spiteri at Goulburn Prison.
Renee had broke off the friendship between herself and Camilla. Now, Camilla wanted to get the ultimate revenge. She would break the relationship between Braden and Renee. It was blunt and brutal in its execution. That goes a long way to explaining Renee's reaction to it all.
I think on the last day Renee went to the Gap, she was sort of conflicted, confused. I don't think she really knew what she was thinking. Maybe she received a message and she found out it was all over or it was all a joke and not what she had expected. I just think she would have been feeling very alone, shocked, maybe embarrassed. It would have been a lot for her to take in.
When police searched Camilla's house, they seized a number of phones. What they didn't find during that search was essentially the Braden phone, the phone Camilla had been using to communicate as Braden. But crucially, in Camilla's phone, they found the photo of Braden that had been used to begin the lie. And that's when Camilla effectively fesses up and says, okay, I was communicating with Braden, but only because Renee wanted me to. She and Renee had apparently created fictitious Braden as a way of masking their own lesbian love affair, which neither family was going to accept.
That infuriated me because I don't care if you're gay, lesbian. Renee knew she could have come to me with anything and we would have accepted her the way she was. She's my daughter.
There is no criminal offence for catfishing in New South Wales.
How can anybody mentally abuse someone into the oblivion and not be held accountable for it? It's beyond my comprehension. It beggars belief.
A woman accused of tricking her friend into believing she was in an online relationship with a man has today spoken at an inquest for the first time.
Teresa and I and the family have been waiting 7 years for some answers. We were hoping that Camilla would come along to the inquest and volunteer that information.
I want to know if Renee found out Camilla was Braden. I wanted her to tell us what she said in those final text messages. I wanted the truth.
Camilla gave them nothing. Her evidence was the same all along. She and Renee were actually so in love that they needed to invent a fake persona to mask it. Lawyers repeatedly put evidence to Camilla that proved Renee did not think Braden was fake. Why would she contact the Greek consulate? Why would she make an appointment with a wedding photographer? The thousands of text messages Renee wrote to Braden. All along, in response to every single one, she would simply say things like, I don't know. I can't remember. That was just Renee in character.
Every time she opened her mouth, she lied. I felt so much despair.
Why were you catfishing your friend?
I felt angry. I felt hopeless.
I trusted you. You came into my home.
One email said, I swear, baby, anyone who ever takes you away from me is going to be sorry. And I swear to God, kid, you abuse me, I'll laugh. You kill me, I'll be your ghost. You hate me, I'll still love you, run away, chase you. You hide, I'll hunt you down. It was a real shock and took you right to the centre of what the friction of their relationship was like. During the inquest, the photo of Braden Spiteri is published, and a fella called Cameron Lang makes contact with police and says, hang on a minute, that's me. I don't know these people. It turns out that Camilla had bumped into this guy at a nightclub and they had their photo taken together with her head on his shoulder.
She's robbed Renee of her life, you know, and Renee's not going to, she hasn't gone in vain, and I'll make sure of that.
It started with a street, so quiet people forgot to lock their doors. Maple Hollow wasn't the kind of place where crime stories happened. It was the kind of place where newspapers ran headlines about bake sales and high school championships. A quiet town tucked between cornfields and slow highways, where the loudest sound most nights was the wind pushing through oak trees. But on a humid evening in August, 24 years ago, something shifted in Maple Hollow. Something invisible. Something that would sit quietly in police files for decades until the day it exploded back into the headlines as a cold case that refused to stay buried. The last person to see 16-year-old Emily Carter alive said she was smiling. It was a little after 8:30 p.m. when Emily stepped out of the Carter family home, a small white house at the end of Birch Lane. She had a backpack slung over one shoulder and a cassette player in her hand, headphones tangled around the strap. Her mother watched from the kitchen window. Emily said she was meeting friends at the football field. Nothing unusual about that. Friday night lights were a ritual in Maple Hollow. Teenagers gathered under the bleachers, trading gossip and music while the marching band rehearsed under the fading sunset. Emily never made it there. At first, nobody panicked. Teenagers stayed out late. Phones weren't always answered. Curfews bent and stretched during summer nights. But when midnight passed, then 2 a.m, and Emily's bedroom remained empty, the Carter family began dialing numbers. Friends, teammates, neighbors. No one had seen her. The first police report was filed at 3:12 a.m. Missing juvenile. Possible runaway. That phrase, runaway, sat like a stain on the investigation from the very beginning. Maple Hollow Police Department had exactly 12 officers on staff at the time. Missing teenagers, statistically speaking, often returned within 48 hours. Arguments with parents. Romantic drama. Temporary rebellion. But something about Emily's disappearance didn't fit. Her car was still parked in the driveway. Her wallet was still in her desk drawer. And her mother swore Emily had left with only one thing, that old blue backpack. By sunrise, search teams were moving through the neighborhood. Flashlights swept through backyards. Volunteers checked wooded areas behind Birch Lane. Officers knocked on doors, asking the same question over and over again. Did you see Emily Carter last night? Most people shook their heads. One neighbor said he thought he saw someone walking along the road around 9, but it was too dark to be certain. Another said a car drove past slowly around the same time. Nothing concrete. Nothing useful. Then came the first strange detail. At 10:47 a.m., a volunteer searcher walking along Mill Creek found something half-buried in tall grass near the roadside. A cassette player. Headphones still plugged in. Inside the player was a tape labeled in black marker, Summer Mix. Police bagged it immediately. The location raised more questions than answers. Mill Creek Road wasn't on the path to the football field. In fact, it was nearly 2 miles in the opposite direction. If Emily had planned to meet friends at school, why would she be out there? The search widened. Helicopters circled above farmland. Divers checked shallow creek beds. Dogs traced scent trails through the trees. But every trail seemed to end the same way. At the road. As if Emily Carter had simply stepped into a car and vanished. Within days, the story spread beyond Maple Hollow. Local news stations began running the headline. Teen missing in Quiet Town, community searches for answers. Posters appeared on telephone poles. Grocery stores displayed photographs of Emily's smiling yearbook portrait. 16 years old. Brown hair. Green eyes. Last seen wearing a gray hoodie and blue jeans. Tips came in from surrounding counties. A waitress thought she saw Emily at a diner along Route 16. A truck driver claimed he picked up a hitchhiker matching her description. Every lead was investigated. Every lead collapsed. Weeks passed. The Carter house filled with casseroles and sympathetic whispers. But the most unsettling detail emerged almost by accident. A patrol officer reviewing neighborhood interviews noticed something peculiar. One house had never been checked. It sat directly across the street from the Carter home. A modest brick house with a neat lawn and a freshly painted fence. The resident had been away the night Emily disappeared. According to neighbors, he worked late shifts. His name was Daniel Reeves, 32 years old. Quiet. Polite. The kind of neighbor people waved to, but didn't know very well. When officers finally spoke to him, his story seemed simple. He had been working that night. A maintenance technician at a regional hospital 40 miles away. Clock-in records confirmed it. Security footage even showed him entering the building shortly after 9 p.m. For detectives, that appeared to close the door. Daniel Reeves was ruled out. The investigation moved on. But small towns remember things. Months after Emily vanished, people began replaying the night in their minds. Little details surfaced. A porch light flickering across the street. A car parked oddly close to the curb. A shadow moving near the Carter driveway. None of it could be proven. None of it was reported in time. And slowly, painfully, the search faded. Winter came. The posters curled and peeled from rain. Media coverage disappeared. Emily Carter became a file inside a metal cabinet labeled Missing Persons. The official theory settled on one of two possibilities: runaway, or abduction by someone passing through town. Either way, the trail had gone cold. Years passed. Maple Hollow changed the way small towns always do, slowly, quietly. New houses were built. Children grew up. People stopped talking about the disappearance except in hushed tones when the subject drifted into conversation. But the Carter family never stopped looking. Every birthday, Emily's mother placed a candle in the kitchen window. Every anniversary of the disappearance, her father called the police department asking the same question. Any updates? The answer was always the same. No new leads. By the 10th year, the case officially became what investigators dread the most. A cold case. No suspects. No body. No clear explanation for what happened on that warm August night. Then, 24 years later, a detective opened the file again. Not because of a tip. Not because of a confession. But because of a single piece of evidence that had been sitting quietly in storage the entire time. A cassette player. Inside an evidence bag. With fingerprints nobody had been able to identify in 1999. Technology had changed since then. And what those prints revealed would send a shockwave through Maple Hollow and point investigators directly back to the one house they thought they had already cleared. The brick house across the street. Daniel Reeves. The neighbor who had watched the Carter family for years while Emily Carter remained missing. And the moment detectives realized that connection, the cold case that had slept for nearly a quarter-century began to move again, slowly at first, like something waking from a long, restless sleep, and then all at once, with the terrifying possibility that the truth had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The cassette player had been sitting in a sealed evidence bag for nearly a quarter of a century. Dust had gathered on the metal shelf where it rested, inside a storage room in the basement of the Maple Hollow Police Department. The label attached to the bag was fading. The ink had begun to blur into the paper after years of humidity and fluorescent light. Evidence Item 17. Recovered near Mill Creek Road. Possible belonging of missing juvenile, Emily Carter. For 24 years, nobody expected it to speak again. Back in 1999, the forensic lab had tried to lift fingerprints from the plastic casing. The results had been frustratingly incomplete. Partial prints. Smudged ridges. Nothing strong enough to compare with the limited databases of that era. Technology had simply reached its limit, so the cassette player was logged, bagged, and filed away, like so many other fragments from unsolved cases. But Detective Aaron Holt had spent most of his career inside cold case files, and he understood something about time. Time didn't always erase evidence. Sometimes it made evidence louder. New databases. New forensic techniques. New algorithms capable of reading fingerprints once considered useless. That realization brought him down into the evidence room on a gray morning in late October. He pulled the bag from the shelf and studied the old label. Emily Carter. The name still carried weight in Maple Hollow. Even detectives who hadn't been born when she disappeared knew the story. Holt placed the bag on the metal table and carefully opened it. The cassette player inside looked frozen in time. Blue plastic casing. Scratches along the side. A small crack near the battery cover. He held it up to the fluorescent light. 24 years earlier, someone had touched this device. Someone who wasn't Emily Carter. And maybe now, finally, technology could tell them who. The cassette player was sent to the state forensic lab 3 days later. A technician named Laura Kim ran the new scan. Instead of relying on full prints, the software analyzed microscopic ridge fragments, pieces that older systems couldn't interpret. The machine processed the image slowly. Lines forming. Patterns aligning. Database comparisons rolling across the screen. Then the system paused. A match probability began climbing. 70%. 82. 91. Laura leaned closer. The number stabilized at 97.4%. She stared at the name attached to the fingerprint record. For a moment, she wondered if the database had made a mistake. Because the match belonged to someone who had never been considered a suspect. Someone who had lived directly across the street from Emily Carter the night she vanished. Daniel Reeves. The report reached Detective Holt's desk 2 days later. He read it once. Then again. Reeves had been interviewed back in 1999. The original detectives had cleared him quickly. His alibi appeared solid. Time-stamped security footage placed him entering the hospital where he worked shortly after 9 that night. But Holt had investigated cold cases long enough to know something unsettling. Alibis sometimes looked stronger on paper than they were in reality. And fingerprints didn't appear by accident. There were only a few explanations. Emily had handed him the cassette player voluntarily. He had found it after she dropped it. Or he had been there the night she disappeared. Holt requested the original case file. 3 thick binders arrived from the archives. The first thing he noticed was how fast the original investigation had moved past Daniel Reeves. Interview conducted August 14th. Alibi confirmed August 15th. Subject cleared August 16th. 2 days. That was all the scrutiny the neighbor across the street had received. Holt leaned back in his chair. 2 days felt rushed. He turned the pages slowly. Daniel Reeves had told investigators he left his house around 8:30 p.m. to drive to work at St. Mark's Regional Hospital. The commute took about 40 minutes. Security cameras recorded him entering the employee entrance at 9:14 p.m. But something about that timeline bothered Holt. Emily Carter had been seen leaving her house around 8:30. Exactly the same time. Across the street. 2 houses facing each other under the same quiet stretch of Birch Lane. The possibility felt too large to ignore. Holt drove through Maple Hollow that afternoon. The town looked almost identical to the old photographs in the file. Same tree-lined streets. Same slow traffic lights blinking over the intersection downtown. Birch Lane was quieter than he expected. The Carter house still stood at the end of the road. White siding. Blue shutters. A porch swing creaking gently in the wind. But it wasn't the Carter family living there anymore. They had moved away years ago. Across the street stood the brick house. Daniel Reeves' house. The lawn was trimmed neatly. A pickup truck sat in the driveway. Holt parked a few houses down and watched the place for several minutes. Nothing unusual. Just a normal suburban home, which made the situation even more disturbing. For 24 years, Daniel Reeves had continued living in the same house directly across from the place where Emily Carter vanished. If he had been involved, he had done something almost unthinkable. He had remained there, watching, waiting, living quietly while the mystery slowly faded. Holt knocked on the door just before sunset. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Daniel Reeves looked older than the photo in the file. Gray hair now. Deep lines around his eyes. But the same calm expression. The same quiet presence neighbors had described decades earlier. Yes. Holt showed his badge. Daniel Reeves. Reeves nodded slowly. I'm Detective Holt with Maple Hollow PD. A flicker of confusion crossed Reeves' face. What's this about? Holt studied him carefully. It's about Emily Carter. The reaction was subtle. A brief tightening in Reeves' jaw. A momentary shift in his eyes. But he recovered quickly. That was a long time ago, Reeves said quietly. Yes, Holt replied. It was. The detective held up a photograph of the cassette player. We found fingerprints on this. Reeves looked at the image. For a split second, something moved across his face. Recognition. Then calm again. That's hers, right? Reeves said. Yes. Holt paused. Your fingerprints are on it. The silence stretched. Wind rustled through the trees along Birch Lane. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Reeves leaned against the doorframe. I don't remember touching it. Holt didn't respond. People rarely remembered the things that mattered most in cold case investigations. Mind if we talk inside? Holt asked. Reeves hesitated. Then stepped aside. The interior of the house looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Family photographs lined the walls. A recliner sat near the window. A television murmured softly in the background. The home of a man who had lived a quiet, uneventful life. Or at least, that's what it appeared to be. Holt sat at the kitchen table while Reeves poured himself a glass of water. "You were interviewed back in 1999, Holt said. Reeves nodded. "I remember. You said you left for work around 8:30. "That's right. Same time Emily left her house." Reeves shrugged slightly. "Could be." Holt placed the fingerprint report on the table. "Your print was on her cassette player." Reeves stared at the paper. "Maybe she dropped it sometime before that night." 2 miles away from the football field? Reeves didn't answer immediately. Holt leaned forward. "The thing about cold cases," he said quietly, "is that they don't disappear. They just wait." The room felt smaller suddenly. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder. Reeves finally spoke. "I didn't hurt that girl." Holt watched him closely. "Then help me understand something." The detective slid another photograph across the table. An aerial image of Mill Creek Road, the location where the cassette player had been found. "Why would your fingerprints be on something she dropped out there?" Reeves rubbed his forehead slowly. "I don't know." Holt let the silence grow. Sometimes silence forced people to fill the space with truth. Or lies. Both were useful. Finally Reeves looked up. "You think I kidnapped her?" "I think your fingerprints were on an object found near the last place she might have been." "That doesn't mean anything." Holt stood. "It means enough for us to start asking questions again." As he walked toward the door, he paused. "One more thing," Holt said. Reeves turned. "You were the only neighbor whose house faced the Carter driveway directly." Reeves said nothing. Holt stepped outside into the fading evening light. Birch Lane looked peaceful. The same quiet street that had existed 24 years earlier. But now the case that everyone believed had died was moving again. And somewhere inside the quiet brick house across the street, Daniel Reeves sat alone in his kitchen. A man who had lived undisturbed for decades. Until the moment a forgotten cassette player started speaking again. The moment Detective Aaron Holt stepped out of Daniel Reeves' house, the street felt different. Birch Lane looked exactly the same as it always had: quiet pavement, trimmed lawns, soft wind moving through tall maple trees. But now every detail seemed sharper, heavier, like a photograph slowly coming into focus after years of blur. Across the road sat the Carter house, the place where Emily Carter had last been seen alive. For 24 years, investigators had studied that house as the starting point of a disappearance. A girl walks out the door. A girl vanishes into the night. End of trail. But now Holt couldn't stop looking at the house directly opposite. Reeves' house. If someone had been watching Emily leave that night, that house offered the perfect view. Kitchen window facing the driveway. Front porch facing the street. Direct line of sight. Holt sat in his car for several minutes, replaying the conversation inside. Daniel Reeves had remained calm, almost too calm. No anger, no visible panic. Just a steady voice repeating the same line. "I didn't hurt that girl." Cold case detectives learned long ago that the most dangerous suspects were rarely the loud ones. The loud ones cracked early. The quiet ones held themselves together for decades. Reeves had done exactly that. 24 years of ordinary life. 24 years without a single accusation. But fingerprints didn't lie. Holt started the engine and drove back toward the police station, the old case file sitting on the passenger seat beside him like a ghost that had finally decided to speak. Inside the station, the evening shift had already begun. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Holt carried the binders into the briefing room. 2 other detectives joined him, Detective Maria Sanchez and Lieutenant Robert Garner, both veterans who remembered the Emily Carter investigation from its early days. Holt laid the fingerprint report on the table. Sanchez read the name twice. "Daniel Reeves," she said slowly. Garner leaned forward. "The neighbor?" Holt nodded. Print lifted from the cassette player recovered on Mill Creek Road. Silence settled across the room. Garner rubbed his jaw. "That thing sat in evidence for 24 years. "Technology caught up," Holt replied. Sanchez flipped open the old case file. "He had an alibi." "On paper," Holt said. Garner looked up sharply. "You think it's weak?" "I think it deserves another look." Sanchez began scanning the timeline. Emily leaves the Carter house around 8:30. Holt nodded. Reeves claims he leaves for work at the same time. Garner tapped the page. Hospital camera shows him entering at 9:14. 40-minute drive, Sanchez said. Which means he could have left any time before 9 and still made it there, Holt replied. Garner leaned back in his chair. You're suggesting he crossed the street, grabbed her, then drove to work like nothing happened. I'm suggesting we don't know what happened. Sanchez looked at the fingerprint image again. But we know he touched that cassette player. And that changed everything. The next step was simple. Rebuild the timeline from scratch. Every minute of that night. Every movement on Birch Lane. Detectives pulled the old neighborhood interview transcripts, dozens of statements from residents who had spoken to police back in 1999. Most were short. I didn't see anything. Just another quiet night. But buried among them were small fragments investigators hadn't noticed before. Or hadn't understood. One neighbor remembered headlights briefly stopping near the Carter driveway around 8:40. Another said they heard a car door slam. Someone else mentioned a figure standing near the curb. Back then those details meant nothing. Now they began forming a different picture. Because if Reeves had been watching from his window, he would have known exactly when Emily walked outside. Exactly when the street was empty. Exactly how much time he had before anyone noticed. Sanchez highlighted one line from an old interview. Listen to this, she said. She read aloud. Witness reports seeing a dark pickup truck parked briefly along Birch Lane around 8:45 p.m. Garner frowned. Reeves owns a pickup. Holt nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to move. But cold cases required something stronger than suspicion. They needed proof. And that meant digging deeper into Daniel Reeves' life. The background check began the next morning. Reeves had lived in Maple Hollow since 1995. Moved there alone. No wife. No children. Worked maintenance jobs his entire life. Quiet. Reliable. Invisible. His record showed no violent crimes. But there was something interesting buried 15 years earlier. A complaint filed by a coworker. Nothing criminal, just a workplace incident report. The description caught Holt's attention immediately. Employee observed watching female staff members in locker area. No disciplinary action taken. Holt read the line twice. Not evidence, but behavior. Patterns mattered in cold cases, especially patterns that had been ignored the first time. Meanwhile, Sanchez tracked down old employment records from St. Mark's Regional Hospital, the place where Reeves claimed to be working the night Emily disappeared. The building still had archives going back decades. Security logs. Shift schedules. Maintenance reports. One detail jumped out almost immediately. Reeves' shift didn't technically begin until 10 p.m. Sanchez walked into Holt's office, holding the document. You're going to want to see this. He scanned the page. Start time, 2200 hours. That's weird, Holt said. Right? Why show up at 9:14 if your shift starts at 10? Sanchez shrugged. Maybe he liked getting there early. Or maybe he needed an alibi. The possibility hung in the air. Because if Reeves had time before work, the timeline opened wide. 8:30. Emily leaves the Carter house. 8:35. Reeves steps outside. A short conversation across the street. Maybe she trusts him. He's the neighbor after all. Maybe he offers her a ride. Maybe something else happens. By 8:45, witnesses see a pickup truck near the driveway. By 9:14, Reeves appears calmly on hospital security cameras 40 miles away. If that theory was correct, everything happened within 15 minutes. Fast. Efficient. Almost practiced. But one question remained. If Reeves took Emily, where did she go? There had never been a body. No clothing. No confirmed sightings. Just a cassette player lying in tall grass 2 miles away. Holt returned to Mill Creek Road that afternoon. The same stretch of asphalt where volunteers had searched decades earlier. Cornfields stretched toward the horizon. Wind rippled through tall grass along the ditch. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the original evidence marker location. Back in 1999, the area had been combed for hours. But investigators at the time believed Emily had likely been taken far outside the town. Nobody expected the answer might still be nearby. Cold cases had a strange habit of hiding their truths in the simplest places. Holt crouched beside the ditch. Cars passed occasionally along the road, their engines fading into the distance. He imagined the scene 24 years earlier. A truck pulling over briefly. A door opening. Someone tossing a cassette player into the grass. A quick attempt to erase a connection. What Reeves couldn't have predicted was how forensic science would change. How a single fingerprint would survive. How decades later someone would finally look again. Holt stood and stared down the empty road. If Reeves had been involved, the cassette player was only the beginning. Because somewhere between Birch Lane and this lonely stretch of highway, something had happened to Emily Carter. And if the truth had been buried nearby all this time, Maple Hollow was about to discover that its quiet streets had been hiding a secret for nearly a quarter of a century. A secret that was slowly pulling investigators back toward the same man they once cleared. The same neighbor who had lived peacefully across the street. Watching, waiting, and possibly carrying a truth that had remained silent for 24 years. Cold cases don't reopen with sirens and flashing lights. They reopen quietly. A file moves from a dusty shelf to a detective's desk. A name that once meant nothing suddenly becomes the center of everything. A detail overlooked decades earlier starts to glow like a warning light. And once that process begins, the past starts shifting. Detective Aaron Holt felt at the moment the investigation turned fully toward Daniel Reeves. The man had lived almost half his life without suspicion. 24 years of quiet routines. Same house, same town, same job paths drifting from one maintenance position to another. But the moment his fingerprint appeared on the cassette player, that calm history began to fracture. Now, every piece of his life had to be examined again. The first step was something investigators called geographic reconstruction. If Reeves had been involved in Emily Carter's disappearance, where could he have taken her in the short window before showing up at the hospital? The drive from Birch Lane to St. Mark's Regional Hospital followed a narrow network of rural roads. Long stretches of farmland. Patches of forest. A handful of abandoned gravel pits. Plenty of places where someone could disappear. But Holt believed the answer might be closer than anyone expected. Because criminals often choose locations they already know. Places they've seen before. Places they're comfortable navigating in the dark. Which meant investigators needed to understand exactly where Daniel Reeves spent his time back in 1999. The record search began with his old work routes. Maintenance technicians at St. Mark's didn't just fix things inside the hospital. They were often sent to remote utility stations, pump houses, and storage facilities scattered throughout the county. Sanchez pulled the archived service logs. A map slowly formed on the whiteboard in the briefing room. Red markers appeared across the county. Water treatment facility. Power substation. Old maintenance garage near County Road 8. But one location stood out. An abandoned quarry site about 15 minutes from Maple Hollow. Reeves had been assigned there multiple times during the summer of 1999. The place had a name locals still recognized. Ridgeview Quarry. Closed since the late 80s. Steep rock walls. Deep pools of stagnant water. Overgrown access roads barely visible from the highway. The kind of place teenagers sometimes explored during the day. The kind of place nobody visited at night. Holt stared at the map. Birch Lane to Ridgeview Quarry. 10-minute drive. Quarry to the highway leading toward the hospital. Another 25 minutes. The timeline worked. Too well. Which meant investigators needed to see the place again. The road leading to Ridgeview Quarry was little more than a strip of cracked pavement cutting through dense trees. Holt and Sanchez drove slowly, headlights pushing through the shadows as the afternoon sky began turning gray. When the road ended, the forest opened suddenly. A massive pit carved into the earth decades earlier. Jagged cliffs dropping into dark water. Rusting fences bent inward where trespassers had climbed through over the years. The place felt abandoned in the deepest sense of the word. Silent. Heavy. The kind of silence that seemed to swallow sound. Holt stepped out of the car and walked toward the edge. Wind moved across the water far below. If someone wanted to hide something, Sanchez said quietly, this place would do it.
Holt nodded.
Back in 1999, search teams had focused on areas near Mill Creek Road, where the cassette player was found. Nobody had reason to check here. Nobody had reason to suspect the quiet neighbor across the street. But now the quarry felt different. Not proof, just possibility. And cold case detectives learned to follow possibility wherever it led. They requested ground-penetrating radar equipment from the State Investigative Unit the next morning. Within 48 hours, the quarry site was crawling with investigators. Survey teams walked the overgrown access road. Cadaver dogs moved through the brush. Technicians scanned patches of disturbed earth along the tree line. Local news helicopters circled overhead. For the first time in decades, Emily Carter's name returned to television screens across the county. Authorities reopened 24-year cold case. New evidence emerges in Emily Carter disappearance. In Maple Hollow, the reaction was immediate. People who had grown up hearing the story suddenly realized the mystery might finally have an answer. And the most shocking part? The focus was now on a man many of them had seen around town for years. Daniel Reeves. The neighbor. The quiet one. The man who waved politely from his driveway. The Carter family heard the news from a reporter's phone call. Emily's mother, Patricia Carter, had moved 2 states away after the disappearance. But the moment the detective's office confirmed the fingerprint match, Holt called her personally. He explained carefully. New forensic analysis. Reopened investigation. A person of interest. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Patricia Carter asked a question that carried 24 years of pain. Do you think he knows where my daughter is? Holt didn't answer immediately, because cold cases rarely offered certainty. Ma'am, he finally said, we're trying to find out. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves seemed to realize the world around him was changing. 2 days after Holt's initial visit, officers conducting surveillance noticed something unusual. Reeves was cleaning his truck. Not casually, thoroughly. Interior removed. Carpets taken out. Every surface scrubbed. It might have been innocent. Or it might have been panic arriving 24 years too late. Holt obtained a warrant to examine the vehicle. When investigators processed the pickup in the police garage, the results were inconclusive. No blood. No visible biological evidence. But forensic teams did find something interesting beneath the rear seat. A small patch of carpet that had clearly been replaced. Newer material stitched carefully into the older flooring. Sanchez studied it under the lab lights. When do you think that was done? Holt shrugged. Could have been any time. But why replace just that section? Good question. And one that began pushing the investigation toward a decision investigators had avoided for decades. It was time to bring Daniel Reeves in for a formal interrogation, because the quiet conversation at his kitchen table was no longer enough. Too many new questions had appeared. Too many old assumptions had collapsed. And somewhere in those missing years between Emily Carter's last steps on Birch Lane and the cassette player lying in tall grass, Daniel Reeves might hold the answer. The interrogation room at Maple Hollow Police Department had barely changed since the late 90s. Same metal table. Same 2 chairs. Same fluorescent light humming above the mirror. Reeves sat calmly when detectives entered. Hands folded. Expression neutral. But the situation had shifted dramatically. Because now the investigation had something it never had before. Evidence pointing directly toward him. Holt placed the quarry photographs on the table. Then the fingerprint report. Then a copy of Reeves' hospital shift schedule. Reeves looked at the documents slowly. His eyes moved across the pages. When he finally spoke, his voice remained steady. I already told you, he said quietly. I didn't hurt that girl. Holt leaned forward. Then explain the fingerprint. Silence. Explain why your shift started at 10 but you showed up 45 minutes early. More silence. Explain why your truck carpet was replaced. Reeves exhaled slowly. The room felt tighter now. 24 years of distance between the crime and this moment. 24 years of quiet. But the walls were closing in. And outside the interrogation room, Maple Hollow was beginning to realize something terrifying. The answer to the town's oldest mystery might have been living in plain sight the entire time. Right across the street. The interrogation room was never designed for comfort. A metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs facing each other. Fluorescent lights humming above like a quiet electrical buzz that never stopped. The air inside always felt slightly colder than the rest of the building. Daniel Reeves sat motionless at the table. Hands folded, back straight. The kind of posture detectives learn to watch carefully. Some suspects slouched under pressure. Others paced or fidgeted. Reeves did neither. He simply waited. Detective Aaron Holt took the seat across from him while Maria Sanchez leaned against the wall near the observation mirror. Neither detective spoke for several seconds. Silence in interrogation rooms had weight. It forced the mind to fill the empty space. Finally, Holt slid the fingerprint report across the table again. "Your print was on Emily Carter's cassette player," he said quietly. Reeves looked at the page but didn't touch it. "I've already told you," he replied. "I don't remember ever touching it." "That's the problem," Holt said. He tapped the photograph. The cassette player wasn't found in her house. It wasn't found near the school. It was found 2 miles away on Mill Creek Road. Reeves remained still. "So the question becomes simple," Holt continued. "How did your fingerprint get there?" Reeves lifted his eyes slowly. "I don't know." The answer came too quickly. Too clean. Holt had heard it thousands of times. When suspects ran out of explanations, they defaulted to confusion. Sanchez stepped forward and placed another document on the table. Reeves glanced down. "Hospital employment records. Shift schedule. You told detectives in 1999 your shift started at 9, she said. Reeves frowned slightly. "That's what I remembered. But it actually started at 10. Silence again. Sanchez folded her arms. "So, why were you already inside the hospital at 9:14 p.m.? Reeves rubbed his hands together slowly. "I liked getting there early. 46 minutes early?" He shrugged. "Traffic sometimes." Holt leaned back in his chair. "Daniel, you lived directly across from the Carter family." No response. "You saw Emily grow up." A slight nod. "You saw her leave the house that night." Reeves' jaw tightened. "I might have." Holt watched him carefully. "Did you talk to her?" Another pause. "I don't remember." That answer hung in the air longer than the others. Because memory didn't usually fail in small moments like that. People remembered conversations with neighbors, especially the last conversation they might have had before a girl disappeared forever. Holt slid a photograph of Birch Lane onto the table. An aerial shot. 2 houses facing each other across the narrow road. "From your kitchen window," Holt said softly, "you could see the Carter driveway perfectly." Reeves looked at the image. His breathing had changed slightly now. Still calm, but slower. Holt leaned forward. "What happened when she walked out the door?" Reeves' eyes lifted again. "I told you. I don't know." Sanchez stepped closer, then explained something else. She placed a new photograph beside the others. The interior of Reeves' pickup truck. Specifically the rear floor area, where the carpet had been replaced. "This section was cut out and replaced sometime in the past," she said. Reeves studied the photo. "Truck got damaged once." "When?" "I don't remember." "Convenient." Reeves said nothing. Holt stood slowly and walked toward the observation mirror. From Reeves' perspective, it looked like nothing more than dark glass. But on the other side, 2 additional investigators watched every movement, every change in expression. Holt turned back. "You know something interesting about cold cases, Daniel?" Reeves didn't answer. "People think time makes them safe." Holt returned to the table and rested his hands on the metal surface. "But time actually works against them." Reeves remained silent. "Because the truth doesn't disappear," Holt continued. "It just waits for technology to catch up." He tapped the fingerprint report again. "And eventually it does." Reeves looked down at the paper. His fingers moved slightly along the table. Not panic, but tension. The first visible crack. Sanchez seized the moment. "Did you offer Emily a ride that night?" Reeves shook his head slowly. "No." "Did she get into your truck?" "No." "Did you drive her somewhere?" "No." The answers came quickly now. Almost automatic. But Holt noticed something subtle. Reeves avoided eye contact during the last question. Then help me understand something, Holt said. He pulled out another document. This one much older. A printed map. Highlighted roads leading from Birch Lane toward Ridgeview Quarry. We searched this place yesterday, Holt said. Reeves' eyes flickered. Just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Sanchez noticed it too. That quarry was one of your maintenance routes in 1999, she said quietly. Reeves' face remained neutral. I worked a lot of places. You were there 6 times the summer Emily disappeared. So. Holt leaned forward again. It's 10 minutes from your house. No response. It's isolated. Still silence. And it connects directly to the highway you'd use to reach the hospital. Reeves' fingers tightened slightly. Holt lowered his voice. Did you take Emily there? For the first time since the interrogation began, Daniel Reeves' calm expression wavered. Not dramatically. Just a flicker. But detectives trained for years to recognize that exact moment. The moment a suspect realizes investigators might actually be getting close. Reeves leaned back in his chair. I want a lawyer. The words landed quietly in a room, but they carried enormous meaning. Interrogations changed instantly when that sentence appeared. Holt nodded slowly. That's your right. Reeves folded his arms. The conversation was over. At least for now. But outside the interrogation room, the investigation had already reached a point of no return. Because Daniel Reeves had never asked for a lawyer during the first interview 24 years earlier. Back then, he was just a neighbor answering questions. Now, he was something else entirely. A man whose fingerprint sat on evidence recovered the night a girl vanished. A man whose timeline no longer made sense. A man whose calm life was suddenly surrounded by questions he couldn't easily explain. Holt walked into the hallway outside the interrogation room where Sanchez and Lieutenant Garner were waiting. Garner spoke first. He's nervous. Sanchez nodded. That quarry rattled him. Holt looked through the observation window. Reeves sat alone inside the room now. Hands folded again. Calm restored. But something had changed. Garner crossed his arms. So, what's next? Holt answered without hesitation. We keep digging. Because cold cases weren't solved by single breakthroughs. They were solved by pressure. Layer after layer. Evidence tightening slowly around the truth until the person holding it finally had nowhere left to hide. And somewhere beneath the quiet surface of Maple Hollow, that pressure was building. The town could feel it. The media could feel it. And Daniel Reeves could definitely feel it. Because for 24 years he had lived comfortably in the shadow of an unsolved mystery. But now the mystery was staring directly back at him. And the next discovery investigators made would begin turning suspicion into something far more dangerous. Evidence that suggested the truth about Emily Carter might not just be buried in the past. It might still be buried somewhere in Maple Hollow. The request for a lawyer changed the pace of the investigation, but it didn't slow it down. If anything, it accelerated everything. Because when a suspect who had remained calm for 24 years suddenly decided he needed legal protection, detectives took that as a signal. Not proof of guilt, but a sign that the pressure was starting to reach the right place. Daniel Reeves left the station later that evening accompanied by an attorney from a nearby town. He walked through the front doors quietly, avoiding the cameras already gathering outside. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. Reporters had begun arriving by the afternoon. Satellite trucks now lined the street. The story had transformed overnight from a forgotten disappearance into something explosive. Neighbor linked to 24-year cold case. New evidence in Emily Carter investigation. For Maple Hollow, it felt like the town had been pulled backward through time. People who had once helped search fields for the missing girl were now watching television reporters stand in front of Birch Lane again, repeating the same name that had haunted the town for decades. Emily Carter. And now another name was appearing beside it. Daniel Reeves. Inside the police station, the investigation was moving at full speed. Detective Maria Sanchez had returned to the evidence room. If Reeves' fingerprint had been found on the cassette player, there was a possibility that other overlooked evidence might contain something similar. Back in 1999, Forensic teams had collected dozens of items from the Carter property. Door handles, mailbox surfaces, the front gate latch. Most of it had never produced anything useful. But forensic science in 1999 had been limited compared to what was possible now. Sanchez carefully reopened the old boxes. Each item had been sealed for decades. She laid them out on the stainless steel table under bright laboratory lights. A hairbrush from Emily's room. A soda can found near the driveway. The metal latch from the Carter front gate. One by one, the items were scanned again using modern equipment capable of detecting microscopic biological traces. For hours, the lab remained quiet except for the soft hum of machines. Most of the results came back exactly as expected. Nothing. 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 Until the analysis reached the gate latch. The piece of metal had been removed during the original investigation because detectives believed Emily might have touched it while leaving the property. Back then, the only prints recovered belonged to members of the Carter family. But this time the machine detected something else. A faint trace of DNA. Extremely degraded. Barely usable. But enough for comparison. Sanchez watched the computer run the analysis. Minutes passed slowly. Then the screen displayed a familiar name. Daniel Reeves. Not a perfect match, but a strong partial profile. Enough to raise serious questions. Because the Carter family had never reported Reeves visiting their property. Not once. Sanchez carried the report directly into Holt's office. He read it in silence. Gate latch, he said quietly. Yep. Holt leaned back in his chair. That puts him on their property. At some point. Could have been years earlier. Sanchez nodded. Could have been. But both detectives understood the deeper implication. If Reeves had touched the Carter gate around the time Emily disappeared, the timeline became far more dangerous for him. Because now there were two separate pieces of evidence placing him near Emily that night. The cassette player and the gate latch. Two small fragments of contact. Two small cracks in the story he had maintained for decades. Meanwhile, another team of investigators had been reviewing something even more revealing. Daniel Reeves' financial history. People often forgot that money left trails as clear as fingerprints. Old bank statements. Credit card transactions. Gas purchases. In 1999, those records had never been examined closely. Because Reeves wasn't considered a suspect. Now, they were being studied line by line. One charge stood out immediately. August 14, 1999. The morning after Emily disappeared. A purchase at a hardware store just outside Maple Hollow. Items listed on the receipt. Industrial cleaning solvent. Heavy-duty trash bags. Latex gloves. The total was small. Less than $40. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Holt stared at the receipt copy when it arrived. Morning after, he said quietly. Sanchez folded her arms. Interesting shopping list. It wasn't illegal. Not by itself. But combined with the other pieces, it began forming a darker picture. If Reeves had been involved in Emily's disappearance, the events of that night might not have ended quickly. Something might have happened after. Something that required cleaning. Or hiding. Or both. The next step required a warrant. Investigators requested judicial approval to search Reeves' home and property thoroughly. The judge signed it the same afternoon. By evening, Maple Hollow police vehicles lined Birch Lane again. Neighbors stepped outside their houses as officers carried evidence cases toward the brick home across from the old Carter property. For many residents, it felt surreal. They had walked past that house for years. Some had spoken casually with Reeves at the grocery store. Some had waved to him while mowing their lawns. Now investigators in gloves and flashlights were stepping through his front door. Holt entered with the first team. The interior looked exactly as it had during his earlier visit. Neat. Organized. Quiet. But search warrants transformed ordinary homes into something else entirely. Every drawer opened. Every cabinet inspected. Every inch of flooring examined carefully. The living room produced nothing unusual. Neither did the kitchen. But the garage told a different story. Tools lined the walls in perfect rows. Workbenches covered in neatly arranged equipment. And in the far corner, something that immediately caught Holt's attention. A large chest freezer. Unplugged. Empty. But the inside surfaces had been cleaned with extraordinary care. Too clean. Almost polished. Sanchez crouched beside it. Interesting place for a freezer, she said. The garage itself wasn't climate-controlled, which meant the appliance hadn't likely been used for storing normal food. Holt ran his gloved hand along the interior edge. Something about it felt wrong. Swab it, he said quietly. Forensic technicians moved in. Cotton swabs collected microscopic samples from every surface. If biological traces remained, even after years, modern labs might still detect them. But the discovery that truly shifted the atmosphere in the house came an hour later. Inside the basement, hidden behind a row of storage shelves, Detective Garner pulled back a plastic tarp covering the concrete floor. Beneath it lay a rectangular patch of cement noticeably newer than the surrounding surface. Different color, different texture, repaired, or poured later. Garner stared at it for several seconds, then called Holt downstairs. The two detectives stood side by side looking at the patch. The shape was unmistakable, roughly 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, almost exactly the dimensions investigators feared the most. Neither man spoke immediately, because if what they were thinking was true, then the answer to Maple Hollow's oldest mystery might have been sitting beneath that basement floor the entire time. Hidden in silence for 24 years, directly beneath the house across the street. The basement felt colder than the rest of the house. Concrete walls trapped the chill in the air, and the fluorescent work light investigators had set up cast long shadows across the floor. Dust floated slowly through the beam, disturbed by the movement of boots and equipment. But nobody in the room was paying attention to the dust. All eyes were fixed on the patch of concrete. 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, newer than the rest of the basement floor. Detective Aaron Holt crouched beside it, running a gloved hand along the edge where the newer cement met the older slab. The difference in texture was obvious even through the latex. This section hadn't been poured with the rest of the basement decades ago. It had been added later, or replaced. "Get the ground-penetrating radar down here," Holt said quietly. The request traveled quickly upstairs. Within minutes, technicians carried the equipment down the narrow staircase. The machine looked simple, a rectangular scanning unit attached to a small monitor, but it had changed the way investigators searched for hidden graves. If something had been buried beneath the concrete and then covered, the radar might reveal a disturbance in the soil below. The technician powered the unit on. The low electrical hum filled the basement. Everyone stepped back as the scanner began moving slowly across the patch. The screen flickered. Lines appeared, gray shapes forming in layered patterns beneath the concrete. The technician frowned slightly and adjusted the angle. He pushed the scanner across the center of the rectangle. The image changed. A void appeared beneath the slab. Not empty space exactly, but disturbed ground. Soil that had been dug up and then packed back down. The technician looked up. There's definitely been excavation here. No one spoke for a moment, because everyone in the room understood the implication. Something had been buried here, or something had been removed. Holt stood slowly. How deep? The technician studied the screen. Maybe 3 feet below the slab. 3 feet. Just enough to conceal something. Just enough to hide a body. The warrant allowed investigators to search the property, but breaking concrete required an additional approval. Holt called the judge immediately. The explanation took less than 2 minutes. Ground disturbance. Potential burial site. Cold case investigation. The answer came quickly. Permission granted. Within an hour, a small demolition team arrived. The basement filled with the grinding roar of a concrete saw. Dust exploded into the air as the blade carved a clean rectangle along the edge of the newer slab. Upstairs, officers sealed the house and kept reporters at a distance. But the sound of machinery carried through Birch Lane. Neighbors gathered quietly along the sidewalk, watching, whispering. Something serious was happening inside Daniel Reeves' house. Something the town had waited decades to see. Back in the basement, the final section of concrete was lifted slowly with a crowbar. The slab cracked and separated from the soil beneath. Investigators held their breath as the piece was dragged aside. Underneath lay a shallow pit. Dark soil. Loose. Disturbed. The technician knelt and began carefully brushing the surface. For a moment there was nothing, just dirt. Then the brush struck something solid. A faint hollow sound. The technician cleared more soil, and everyone in the room saw it at the same time. Bone. White. Curved. The shape unmistakable. A human rib. The room went completely silent. 24 years of questions collapsed into that single moment. Holt felt the weight of it immediately. Because once bones appeared, the mystery was no longer theoretical. Someone had been buried beneath Daniel Reeves' basement floor. Forensic anthropologists were called in immediately. The excavation process shifted from demolition to careful recovery. Small tools replaced shovels. Paintbrushes replaced hands. Layer by layer, the soil was removed. More bones emerged slowly from the earth. A section of spine. Fragments of arm bones. Then the curve of a skull. The remains were incomplete, but the size suggested a young person. Possibly a teenager. Holt stood near the staircase, watching the process. His mind returned to the phone call with Patricia Carter. Do you think he knows where my daughter is? If the remains belonged to Emily Carter, the Carter family would finally receive the answer they had been waiting for since 1999. But that answer would come with a different kind of pain. The kind that arrives when hope finally runs out. Above ground, the news spread rapidly. Police tape around the Reeves house. Forensic vans parked along the street. And now whispers moving through the crowd. They found something. Bones. Under the basement, television crews began broadcasting live updates. Maple Hollow had transformed into the center of a national true crime story almost overnight. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves sat in a small conference room inside the police station with his lawyer. The man who had lived quietly for 24 years now found himself surrounded by investigators reviewing every detail of his life. His attorney had already heard the first report from the search team. Possible human remains. The lawyer leaned forward across the table. Daniel, is there anything you want to tell me before this gets worse? Reeves stared at the table. His face remained calm, but something had changed. The stillness he had maintained during the interrogation was beginning to crack. I didn't kill her, he said quietly. The lawyer studied him carefully. Did you bury someone in that basement? Reeves closed his eyes briefly, then shook his head. No. But the words sounded thinner now. Less certain. Because if investigators confirmed the remains belonged to Emily Carter, the situation would become impossible to explain. Fingerprints. DNA on the Carter property. Evidence buried beneath his home. Every piece of the puzzle pointing in one direction. Back in the basement, the excavation continued late into the night. By midnight, the forensic team had uncovered nearly the entire skeleton, carefully arranged in the shallow grave. The position of the bones suggested the body had been placed there deliberately. Arms folded close to the chest, legs slightly bent, wrapped originally in something that had long since decomposed. But one detail stood out immediately. Near the skull, partially buried in the soil, investigators discovered a small object. A thin metal chain. Attached to it was a simple pendant shaped like a star. The forensic technician lifted it gently with tweezers. Holt stepped closer. The pendant looked familiar. He pulled a photograph from the old case file. Emily Carter's school picture. Around her neck, the same small star pendant. A gift from her grandmother, according to the original report. Holt felt a heavy silence settle over the basement. Because that small piece of jewelry carried enormous weight. It meant the bones beneath the floor were almost certainly hers. After 24 years, after thousands of hours of searching, Emily Carter had finally been found. But the discovery raised an even darker question. If Daniel Reeves hadn't killed her, then why had her body been buried beneath his house? The discovery in the basement changed everything overnight. For 24 years, Emily Carter had existed as a missing person, a face on old posters, a name spoken carefully by a town that never quite forgot her. Now she was something else. A homicide victim. And the house across the street from where she vanished had just become the center of a murder investigation. By sunrise the next morning, Birch Lane no longer looked like a quiet neighborhood. Police tape stretched across both sides of the street. Forensic vehicles filled the curb. Satellite news trucks hummed with generators as reporters stood in front of cameras delivering updates to viewers across the country. Human remains discovered beneath the home of a man linked to the 24-year-old cold case of missing teen Emily Carter. The words echoed across national broadcasts. Inside the house, the excavation continued. Every bone had to be documented precisely. Every inch of soil around the body had to be collected and examined. Forensic anthropologists worked slowly, their movements careful and deliberate. Because even after 24 years, the ground sometimes held answers. Detective Aaron Holt stood near the edge of the pit watching as the final bones were lifted gently into evidence containers. The skeleton was almost complete, but something immediately struck the forensic team. There were signs of trauma. One of the anthropologists pointed to the skull under the work light. A fracture ran across the side, near the temple. Not the kind caused by natural decay. The kind caused by force. Blunt force. Holt felt the weight of the moment settle deeper. Emily Carter hadn't just been hidden. She had been killed. The medical examiner arrived shortly after. Dr. Lena Ward had worked dozens of cold cases over her career, but even she paused when she saw the remains laid out carefully on the examination table inside the temporary forensic tent. 24 years, she murmured.
Holt nodded.
Ward examined the skull fracture again. Possibly a single strike, she said quietly. With what? Hard object. Something heavy. A pipe. A wrench. A hammer. The possibilities were endless. But the location of the fracture suggested something specific. A sudden attack.
Fast.
Violent. Ward continued her inspection. Another detail appeared along the wrist bones. A thin groove around one of them. Almost like pressure had been applied there for a period of time. She leaned closer. Possible ligature marks, she said. Holt felt a chill move through him. If Emily had been restrained before she died, that meant the crime had been more than a sudden accident. It meant time, control, intent, and that pointed even more directly toward the man who owned the house above the grave. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves remained inside the police station with his lawyer. He had been informed that human remains were found beneath his basement. The attorney had watched his reaction carefully.
Shock.
Confusion. But not the kind of raw panic many suspects displayed when confronted with physical evidence. Reeves had simply shaken his head slowly. The lawyer leaned forward. Daniel, if those remains belong to Emily Carter, you are going to be the primary suspect in a murder case. Reeves rubbed his hands together slowly. I didn't kill her. The words came quietly, almost rehearsed. Then how did she end up buried under your house? Reeves didn't answer. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally, he looked up. I want to go home. The lawyer sighed. That's not going to happen today. Because while Reeves had not been formally charged yet, the discovery of the remains changed the legal landscape dramatically. Detectives now had probable cause. A judge approved an arrest warrant before noon. The charge listed on the document was simple but devastating. Second-degree murder.
Concealment of a body.
At 1:42 p.m., Daniel Reeves was officially placed under arrest. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists in a quiet hallway inside the Maple Hollow Police Department. No struggle. No shouting. Just a slow exhale as officers escorted him toward the booking area. Outside, reporters erupted the moment the news broke. Arrest made in 24-year cold case. Neighbor charged after body found beneath basement. The story exploded across every major news outlet. But inside the investigation room, Holt and Sanchez were still trying to understand the full picture. Because something about the timeline still bothered them. If Reeves had killed Emily the night she disappeared, why keep the body beneath his house? Most criminals panicked. They dumped bodies far away. remote forests, rivers, highways miles from home. But burying someone in your own basement required something different. Confidence, planning, or desperation. Sanchez leaned over the evidence board where photographs from the basement excavation now hung beside the original case file. "You noticed something strange?" she said. Holt looked up. "What?" "The grave."
He studied the photo again.
The pit was shallow, barely 3 feet deep. Just enough space for the body and the concrete slab above it. "That wasn't dug with heavy equipment," Sanchez continued. "Someone dug that by hand." Holt nodded slowly and quickly, which meant something important. The burial likely happened the same night Emily died, or very soon after. Because if Reeves had waited days or weeks, neighbors might have noticed construction noise, concrete mixing, anything unusual. But Birch Lane had reported nothing, which meant the entire sequence of events might have unfolded within hours. Emily disappears.
She dies.
And before sunrise, her body is buried beneath the neighbor's basement. The speed of it was chilling. But another question now hovered over the investigation. If Reeves committed the crime alone, the timeline was incredibly tight. Too tight, maybe. Because at 9:14 p.m. that same night, security cameras showed him calmly walking into the hospital where he worked. No panic. No visible stress. Just a man arriving early for his shift. Holt stared at the security still photograph again. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the frame. 9:14 and 22 seconds p.m., which meant one of two things. Either Reeves committed the crime with terrifying efficiency, or someone else helped him. And if someone else had been involved that night, then the truth behind Emily Carter's death might be even darker than Maple Hollow was prepared to face. Because sometimes cold cases don't hide just one secret. Sometimes they hide two. The moment Daniel Reeves was formally charged, the town of Maple Hollow crossed an invisible line. For years, Emily Carter's disappearance had been a mystery people spoke about with uncertainty, a tragic story that might never have an answer. Now the uncertainty was gone. The bones beneath the basement floor had changed the entire narrative. Emily Carter hadn't run away. She hadn't been taken by a stranger passing through town. She had died less than 100 feet from her own front door. And her body had remained hidden across the street for nearly a quarter of a century. But for Detective Aaron Holt, the case still felt incomplete. Because something about the timeline continued to bother him. Daniel Reeves' arrest had come quickly after the body was discovered. The evidence pointing toward him was already overwhelming. The fingerprint on the cassette player, DNA on the Carter property gate, the grave beneath his basement. For prosecutors, that was more than enough to begin building a murder case. But Holt wasn't interested in only proving Reeves had done it. He wanted to understand exactly how it happened. And the more he studied the timeline, the more one detail refused to settle. The hospital security footage. 9:14 p.m. That timestamp had been verified years earlier, which meant Reeves had reached the hospital at exactly that moment on the night Emily disappeared. But Birch Lane was 40 minutes away. If Reeves had taken Emily, killed her, buried her beneath the basement floor, cleaned up, and then driven to work, the window of time was almost impossibly small. Unless something happened investigators hadn't considered before. Holt called Sanchez into the office.
He pointed at the map again.
Birch Lane to the hospital, he said. 40 minutes. Sanchez nodded. Unless you're driving like a maniac. And even then 35 maybe. Holt tapped the desk slowly. Let's assume Emily left her house around 8:30. Okay. Something happens immediately. Reeves gets her into the house. Sanchez followed the logic. Let's say 5 minutes. Now it's 8:35. Holt continued. An attack happens. Another few minutes. 8:40. Then he drags her body to the basement. Digs a grave. Burial. Concrete patch. Sanchez shook her head. That alone could take hours. Exactly. Holt leaned back. So, how did he walk calmly into a hospital 40 miles away by 9:14? The room fell silent. Because the math simply didn't work. Not for one person. which meant the possibility raised earlier was becoming harder to ignore.
Someone else may have been involved.
The idea wasn't entirely new. During the original investigation in 1999, detectives had briefly explored whether Emily might have been abducted by multiple offenders. But once the case went cold, that theory disappeared. Now it was back. And if it was true, it changed everything. Holt returned to the original witness interviews again. This time he looked at them differently. Not for evidence against Reeves, but for signs of another presence. Another person on Birch Lane that night. One statement stood out. It came from a teenager who had lived 3 houses down from the Carter family. Back then, he had told police something that seemed unimportant. "I saw 2 shadows near the Carter driveway." At the time, investigators assumed he meant Emily and another person, possibly the abductor. But Holt noticed something else. The boy had described the second shadow as taller than Reeves, which meant the witness might not have been describing Reeves at all. Sanchez leaned over the file. "You think someone else grabbed her first, or someone was already there?" The idea seemed unlikely at first, but when they revisited Daniel Reeves' background, a new possibility emerged. Back in 1999, Reeves didn't live entirely alone. For about 6 months earlier that year, a man named Carl Benton had stayed at the house. Temporary roommate. Old co-worker from a maintenance job. The arrangement ended shortly before Emily disappeared. Or at least, that's what Reeves told investigators at the time. Holt searched the database for Benton's name. The record appeared almost immediately. Carl Benton. Age 34 in 1999. Multiple minor arrests over the years. Assault. Public intoxication. Disorderly conduct. Nothing connected to the Carter case. But something about the timeline caught Holt's attention. Benton had moved out of Reeves' house in July of 1999. Just 1 month before Emily vanished. Sanchez crossed her arms. "That's interesting." "Yeah," Holt said quietly. "Especially if he didn't actually move out." They started digging deeper into Benton's history. And what they found made the investigation even more complicated. Benton had disappeared from Maple Hollow almost immediately after Emily Carter vanished. No forwarding address. No new employment records in the area.
Just gone.
Holt stared at the screen. "Either that's a hell of a coincidence," he said slowly, "or Benton knew something." Sanchez nodded. And if he helped Reeves, he might still be the only person who knows exactly what happened that night. But tracking someone after 24 years wasn't simple. People changed names, moved across the country, started new lives. Still, Holt had one advantage. Modern investigative databases connected information that didn't exist decades earlier. Within hours, they found a possible lead. A driver's license issued 12 years ago in another state. Same name, same birth date. Carl Benton, living nearly 900 miles away, working at a construction company.
Married.
2 kids. If it was the same man, he had built an entirely new life far from Maple Hollow. But now the past might be catching up. Holt printed the file and stared at Benton's photograph. Older, heavier, but the same face. And if Benton had been on Birch Lane the night Emily Carter disappeared, the investigation had just expanded dramatically. Because Daniel Reeves might not have been alone when the crime happened. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man who thought he had escaped the shadow of that night might soon hear a knock on his door. A knock that carried 24 years of unanswered questions. And the terrifying possibility that the truth about Emily Carter's final moments had never fully been told. The photograph of Carl Benton sat on the table between Detective Aaron Holt and Maria Sanchez. An ordinary driver's license image. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes staring blankly into a government camera lens. If the records were correct, Benton now lived nearly 900 miles away in a quiet construction town outside Tulsa. A wife. 2 children. A stable job pouring foundations for new suburban homes. The kind of life people built when they believed the past would never catch up to them. But Holt had seen enough cold cases to know something simple. The past always waits. And sometimes it waits decades before knocking. By mid-morning the next day, investigators from Maple Hollow contacted authorities in Oklahoma. The request was straightforward. Locate Carl Benton. Confirm his identity. Ask a few questions. Nothing formal yet, just a conversation. But when officers ran Benton's address through their local system, something unexpected appeared. A police report from 3 years earlier. Domestic disturbance. No arrest. But the responding officer had noted something unusual in the narrative. Benton had become aggressive when questioned. Not violent, but nervous. Almost paranoid. He repeatedly asked officers if they were looking for someone else. At the time it meant nothing. Now the line stood out like a warning flare. Holt read the report carefully. People who carried secrets often reacted that way when confronted by authority, even in unrelated situations. The Oklahoma officers agreed to conduct the visit that afternoon. Holt and Sanchez listened through a speakerphone connection inside the Maple Hollow station. The sound quality was rough. Wind moving across a police radio. Car doors opening. Footsteps on gravel. Then a knock. A man's voice answered. Yeah, Carl Benton. Who's asking? This is the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. A pause. A long one. Then the door opened. Can I help you? The officers asked basic questions first. Identity. Employment. How long he had lived there. Benton answered calmly. But when the name Emily Carter entered the conversation, everything changed. Silence filled the radio. 10 seconds. 15. Then Benton's voice came back. Lower now. Tighter. I don't know anyone by that name. Holt leaned closer to the speaker, because he recognized that tone. It was the sound of someone who had just realized a door they believed closed forever had suddenly reopened. The Oklahoma officer continued carefully. Did you ever live in Maple Hollow? Another pause.
Yeah.
Did you know a man named Daniel Reeves? The response came faster. Not in years. Did you live at his house in 1999? Benton exhaled audibly. Look, what is this about? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked the one question Holt had been waiting for. Do you remember a girl named Emily Carter disappearing that summer? The silence that followed was different this time. Heavier. Longer. And when Benton finally spoke again, his voice had changed. I saw that on the news yesterday. The officer said nothing. Benton continued. Reeves got arrested, right? Did you have anything to do with that case? Another pause. Then something strange happened. Benton laughed. Not loudly. Not comfortably. Just a short, nervous breath of sound.
No, he said.
But the word carried something behind it. Something that sounded dangerously close to fear. Back in Maple Hollow, Holt muted the speaker for a moment. He knows, he said quietly. Sanchez nodded.
Yeah.
The radio came back on. The officer asked the next logical question. Would you be willing to speak with detectives from Minnesota about the case? Benton hesitated. I guess. Good. The officer continued. They'll be contacting you soon. The call ended shortly afterward. Holt sat back slowly, because Benton's reaction confirmed something important. The man hadn't sounded confused. He hadn't asked who Emily Carter was. He hadn't struggled to remember the town. Instead, he had recognized the story instantly, which meant the disappearance had stayed with him all these years. The way certain memories do when someone knows they were closer to a tragedy than they ever admitted. The decision was made quickly. Holt and Sanchez would fly to Oklahoma the next morning. If Benton knew anything about what happened on Birch Lane that night, they needed to hear it directly from him. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves remained inside the county jail awaiting arraignment. News of the body discovery had spread across every national news channel. Reporters described him as a quiet neighbor who had hidden a dark secret for decades. But inside his cell, Reeves maintained the same statement he had repeated from the beginning. I didn't kill her. His lawyer repeated the line during a press conference outside the courthouse. Mr. Reeves maintains his innocence and looks forward to presenting the full facts in court. But the full facts were still forming. Because if Carl Benton had been present the night Emily Carter died, the story might be far more complicated than prosecutors realized. The flight to Tulsa lasted just under 2 hours. Holt spent most of it staring out the airplane window, replaying the timeline again. Emily leaves her house. Something happens near the driveway. 2 shadows reported by a witness. Reeves arrives at the hospital by 9:14. And somewhere in that sequence, another man might have been standing beside him. If Benton talked, the entire chain of events might finally become clear. If he didn't, the case would remain incomplete. The detectives arrived at Benton's address the next afternoon. A small single-story house in a quiet suburban development. Children's bicycles leaned against the garage door. A dog barked somewhere inside. Ordinary life. Holt knocked. Footsteps approached slowly. The door opened. Carl Benton stood in the doorway staring at them. Older than the photograph. More tired. But the recognition in his eyes came instantly. "You're from Maple Hollow," he said. Not a question. A statement.
Holt nodded.
"We need to talk about Emily Carter." For several seconds, Benton didn't move. The silence stretched across the small front porch. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in." The living room looked like the home of any working father. Family photos. Cartoon toys scattered near the couch. But Benton didn't sit. He remained standing near the window, arms crossed tightly. "You found her," he said quietly. Holt felt the weight of the moment. "Yes." Benton closed his eyes briefly. "Under the house." Sanchez exchanged a quick glance with Holt, because they had never told him where the body was found, which meant Benton had already guessed. Or he had known all along. Holt spoke slowly. "Carl, we need you to tell us exactly what happened that night." The room went silent. Outside, a lawn mower hummed faintly somewhere down the street. Inside, Benton stared at the floor for nearly a full minute. When he finally looked up again, his voice had changed. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. And in that moment, after 24 years of silence, the first real crack appeared in the story of Emily Carter's death. Because Carl Benton had just admitted something investigators had suspected for decades. He had been there that night. For a long moment after Carl Benton spoke, the room remained completely still. The words hung in the air between the three of them. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Detective Aaron Holt had heard thousands of statements over the years. Confessions, denials, half-truths that twisted around the edges of reality. But this one carried a particular weight. Because Benton hadn't said it didn't happen. He had said he didn't mean for it to happen. Which meant the story of Emily Carter's final moments was finally beginning to surface after 24 years buried in silence. Holt leaned forward slightly. "What didn't you mean to happen, Carl?" Benton rubbed his hands across his face slowly. The gesture looked like someone trying to wake from a long, uncomfortable dream. "Her dying." Sanchez watched him carefully. "Start from the beginning," she said quietly. Benton nodded once, staring down at the floor. "The night she disappeared, I was still staying at Daniel's house." Holt felt the timeline shift immediately. "You never moved out in July." Benton shook his head. "I was supposed to, but I didn't have anywhere else to go yet." "So, you were there the night Emily left her house?" "Yes." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I saw her walk out." The memory seemed to replay in his mind as he spoke. She was wearing headphones, holding that tape player. The cassette player. The same one found on Mill Creek Road. "What happened next?"
Holt asked.
Benton swallowed. Daniel was watching from the window. The room went silent again. "Watching,"
Sanchez said.
Benton nodded slowly. He'd done it before. Done what? Watch her. The word felt ugly when it landed. He talked about her, sometimes said she was beautiful, said she smiled at him when she walked by. Holt felt a cold weight settle into his chest. A quiet obsession. The kind that sometimes grows unnoticed until something breaks. "What happened when she stepped outside that night?" he asked. Benton continued staring at the carpet. Daniel said he was going to talk to her. "About what?" "I don't know." "Did you go with him?" Benton hesitated, then nodded. "I walked outside a minute later." The image began forming in Holt's mind. Two men standing across the street. a 16-year-old girl walking toward the road. Did Emily know you? Sanchez asked. Not really, but she knew Daniel. Yes. That made the next part easier to imagine, because when danger arrives wearing a familiar face, people often lower their guard. What did Daniel say to her? Holt asked. Benton's jaw tightened. He offered her a ride to the football field. Emily had told her mother she was meeting friends there. The excuse fit perfectly. And she got in the truck? Holt said. Benton nodded. She trusted him. For several seconds, nobody spoke, because that single detail carried enormous weight. Emily Carter had stepped willingly into the vehicle of the man who would ultimately bury her beneath his house. What happened after she got inside? Sanchez asked. Benton exhaled slowly. Daniel started driving, but not toward the school. Did she notice?
Yeah.
Did she say something? She asked where we were going. And Benton closed his eyes again. Daniel told her to relax. Holt felt the tension building toward something darker. Did she try to leave? Yes. Benton's voice cracked slightly now. She got scared. What did Daniel do? For a moment, Benton didn't answer. Then the words came out flat. He grabbed her. Silence filled the living room. Where?
Holt asked.
In the passenger seat. Did you stop the truck?
No.
Benton shook his head quickly. It all happened fast. What happened to the cassette player? She dropped it when he grabbed her. Another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The cassette player thrown out along the road later. What happened next? Sanchez said softly. Benton's hands trembled slightly now. She started screaming. The memory seemed to drag him backward 24 years. Daniel panicked. He reached for something under the seat. What? A wrench. Holt felt his stomach tighten. And then, Benton's voice dropped to a whisper. He hit her. The room went silent. How many times? Holt asked. Once. That matched the fracture on the skull. One hit, Benton continued. And she stopped moving. The sentence sat heavily between them. Emily Carter had died in the front seat of Daniel Reeves' truck, within minutes of stepping outside her house. What did you do? Sanchez asked. Benton looked up for the first time. I told him we needed to go to the police. Holt watched him carefully. And Benton gave a bitter half-smile. Daniel said no one would believe us. Instead, Reeves drove back toward Birch Lane, back to the house across the street from where Emily lived. What happened when you got there? Holt asked. Benton swallowed. We carried her inside. The next hours unfolded in grim detail. They moved her to the basement. Reeves dug the shallow grave, while Benton stood there in shock. Neither of them fully understanding how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. By the time the grave was ready, the sun was beginning to set. They placed her body inside, covered it with soil, then poured the concrete patch over the top. What about the cassette player?
Holt asked.
Daniel drove back out later and threw it along the road. Mill Creek Road. The same place volunteers would discover it the next morning. And after that?
Sanchez said.
Benton stared toward the window. Daniel went to work. The hospital timestamp. 9:14 p.m. Exactly where the timeline said he should be. And you? Holt asked. I stayed in the house. Benton's voice felt hollow now. I didn't sleep that night. The room remained silent for several seconds. 24 years of mystery had just unfolded in a quiet suburban living room hundreds of miles away from Maple Hollow. Holt finally spoke. Why didn't you tell anyone? Benton looked at him.
Fear. Shame.
Exhaustion. All of it mixed together. Because I was afraid. The simplest explanation. And sometimes the most common one. The detective sat quietly for a moment longer. Outside, Benton's children laughed somewhere in the backyard, completely unaware that their father had just confessed involvement in one of the oldest unsolved crimes in another state. Holt stood slowly. Carl Benton, he said calmly, you're under arrest for your role in the death of Emily Carter. Benton didn't resist. He simply nodded once, as if the weight he had carried for 24 years had finally become too heavy to hold any longer. And hundreds of miles away, In the small town of Maple Hollow, the truth about what happened on that warm August night in 1999 was finally complete. Emily Carter had stepped outside her house expecting an ordinary evening. Instead, she walked into the path of two men whose fear and violence would erase her future in a matter of minutes. For 24 years, the town believed the mystery might never be solved. But cold cases have a way of waiting for the one piece of evidence that refuses to disappear. A fingerprint on a cassette player, a buried grave beneath a basement floor, a witness who eventually runs out of silence. And when those pieces finally come together, the truth emerges slowly, but with a force that shakes an entire community. In Maple Hollow, the street where Emily Carter once lived still looks quiet. The same trees, the same houses, the same stretch of road where she took her last steps. But now the silence carries a different meaning, because beneath that silence lies a story that waited 24 years to be told. By the time the plane carrying Detective Aaron Holt and Maria Sanchez landed back in Minnesota, the story had already spread across every major news outlet in the country. Second arrest in 24-year cold case. Former roommate confesses role in Emily Carter death. The name Carl Benton was now permanently attached to the same headlines that had followed Daniel Reeves for days. For the first time since 1999, the mystery of what happened on Birch Lane had a complete narrative. But closure, Holt knew, was never as simple as a confession. Because the truth about a crime didn't end when investigators understood it. It ended when a community finally faced it, and Maple Hollow was about to do exactly that. When the detectives returned to the station, the Carter case board had grown even larger. Photographs filled the wall now. Emily Carter's school portrait, the cassette player found in the grass, the basement grave beneath Reeves' house. Two mugshots pinned side by side. Daniel Reeves, Carl Benton. For 24 years the case had been defined by absence. Now it was defined by evidence. The district attorney's office moved quickly. Benton's confession had been recorded in full. His statements matched nearly every piece of physical evidence recovered during the investigation. The skull fracture, the buried body, the cassette player thrown along Mill Creek Road, the timeline. Every detail fit. But one part of Benton's confession mattered more than anything else. He had described the blow that killed Emily as something sudden, something reckless, something that happened in a moment of panic, which meant prosecutors had a decision to make. Was the crime murder or manslaughter? Because if Reeves had struck Emily during a struggle rather than with premeditated intent, the legal consequences could shift dramatically. Still, the act that followed, burying her body beneath his own basement floor, ensured the charges would remain severe.
Concealment of a body,
Obstruction of justice, and potentially second-degree murder. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves finally spoke again, not to detectives, but through his attorney. The statement came during his first court appearance, where cameras crowded the hallway outside the small Maple Hollow courthouse. Mr. Reeves deeply regrets the events that occurred on August 13, 1999, the lawyer said carefully. He maintains that the death of Emily Carter was a tragic accident. Inside the courtroom, Reeves sat motionless while the charges were read aloud. 24 years had carved lines into his face, but his expression remained strangely calm, almost distant, as if the night that changed everything had happened to someone else. But across the aisle, Emily Carter's parents sat quietly in the front row. They had driven back to Maple Hollow for the first time in years. Patricia Carter held a small photograph of her daughter in both hands. The same photograph that had once been printed on missing person posters all across the county. For 24 years she had lived without knowing where Emily was. Now she knew, and sometimes knowing brought a pain far heavier than uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered in small groups along the sidewalks. Maple Hollow had always been the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other by name. Now many of those same neighbors struggled to understand how the quiet man across the street had carried such a secret for so long. People remembered simple things about Daniel Reeves. He shoveled his driveway in winter. He waved politely when passing on the street. He fixed broken fences for elderly neighbors without asking for money. None of those memories fit easily beside the image of a basement grave. But the truth rarely fits neatly into human expectations. Detective Holt visited Birch Lane one final time before the trial preparations began. The Reeves house now sat empty behind police tape. The basement floor had been removed completely during the excavation. A rectangle of exposed earth remained where the grave had once been. Across the street stood the Carter house.
Different family.
Different curtains in the windows. But the driveway was still the same place where Emily had last been seen. Holt stood quietly on the sidewalk, imagining the final moments described in Benton's confession. Emily stepping outside with her headphones on. The neighbor calling her name. A short conversation. An offer of a ride. A decision that took less than 5 seconds and changed the course of 3 lives forever. Crimes like this rarely began with violence. They began with opportunity. A moment when one person chose to cross a line that should never have been crossed. And once that line was crossed, everything that followed became irreversible. The trial would take months to prepare. Expert testimony. Forensic analysis. Reconstruction of the events in Daniel Reeves' truck. But in truth, the most important part of the story had already been revealed. Emily Carter had been found. Her final moments had been reconstructed. And the 2 men responsible for hiding the truth were finally facing the consequences of that night. Yet even with arrests, confessions, and evidence, something lingered over Maple Hollow. Because cold cases don't just leave scars on victims' families. They leave them on entire communities. For 24 years, the town had lived with an invisible question. Where did Emily go? Now the answer existed. But answers have weight. They force people to confront how close the danger really was. Not a stranger passing through town. Not an unknown criminal from somewhere far away. Just a neighbor. Standing across the street. Watching. Waiting. And when the story of Emily Carter was finally told in full, it revealed something every cold case eventually reminds us of. Time does not erase the truth. It only buries it. Sometimes beneath files in forgotten evidence rooms. Sometimes beneath decades of silence. And sometimes beneath a thin layer of concrete in a quiet basement, waiting patiently for someone to start asking the right questions again. Winter arrived in Maple Hollow quietly. The first snow of the season settled across Birch Lane like a thin white blanket, softening the sharp edges of the houses and sidewalks that had once been the center of a national headline. For a few weeks, the town looked peaceful again. But beneath that quiet surface, everything had changed. The Carter case had moved from investigation to prosecution. Court filings stacked higher every day inside the county courthouse. Prosecutors prepared timelines, witness lists, forensic reports, the long, methodical process that turns a story into a legal argument. Detective Aaron Holt had spent years working cold cases, and he understood something most people didn't. Solving a case didn't mean the story was finished. It simply meant a new chapter had begun. Because once the truth enters a courtroom, it must be rebuilt piece by piece. Every minute, every decision, every movement on the night of August 13th, 1999. The prosecution's case centered on 3 pillars. First, physical evidence. Emily Carter's remains discovered beneath Daniel Reeves' basement floor. The skull fracture consistent with the wrench described in Carl Benton's confession. The star-shaped pendant recovered beside the body. Second, forensic connections. Reeves' fingerprint on the cassette player found along Mill Creek Road. Trace DNA on the Carter property gate latch. The replaced section of carpet in Reeves' pickup truck. And third, perhaps most powerful of all, Benton's testimony. Because Benton had not only confessed, he had agreed to testify. In exchange for a plea deal that reduced his potential sentence, he would describe exactly what happened that night. Every detail. From the moment Emily stepped outside her house to the moment her body was buried beneath the basement floor. For the Carter family, the decision was painful but necessary. Without Benton's testimony, proving the exact sequence of events might have been difficult after so many years. With it, the entire story would unfold in front of a jury. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves remained inside the county detention center. His lawyers worked tirelessly to challenge the prosecution's narrative. Their argument was simple. Yes, Reeves had been present. Yes, the body had been buried beneath his home. But the fatal blow, they insisted, came during a chaotic struggle. An accident. A terrible mistake made in panic. Not murder. The defense strategy aimed to shift the responsibility toward Benton. They suggested Benton might have been the one who escalated the situation. That Reeves had been trying to calm things down when the fatal moment occurred. It was a predictable tactic. When two suspects shared responsibility for a crime, the courtroom often became a battlefield of shifting blame. But outside the courthouse, Maple Hollow watched everything unfold with quiet intensity. The case had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become part of the town's identity. For younger residents, the story of Emily Carter had always existed like a ghost in the background of local history. Now they were seeing the conclusion in real time. The community organized a small memorial near the entrance to Birch Lane. Nothing elaborate. Just a wooden bench beneath a large maple tree. A plaque installed along the backrest. It carried a simple inscription. Emily Carter, 1983 to 1999. Forever remembered. On the day the bench was placed, Patricia Carter returned once again to the street where her daughter had last been seen. The cold air carried the scent of snow and pine as she ran her fingers slowly across the engraved letters. For 24 years, she had imagined countless possibilities about what happened to Emily. Now she finally knew. The truth had not been kind, but it had ended the silence. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the most critical moment of the trial approached. Carl Benton would take the stand. The courtroom was packed the morning he arrived. Reporters filled the back rows. Local residents occupied every available seat. Even some of the original investigators from 1999 had returned to watch the proceedings. Benton entered wearing a dark suit borrowed from his attorney. His hands trembled slightly as he raised them to take the oath. The prosecutor began with simple questions.
Name. Age.
Former residents. Then slowly the questions moved toward Maple Hollow. Mr. Benton, did you live with Daniel Reeves during the summer of 1999? Yes. Were you present on Birch Lane the night Emily Carter disappeared? Benton swallowed. Yes. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Even after weeks of headlines, hearing the words spoken aloud carried enormous weight. The prosecutor continued carefully. Please tell the jury what happened that night. The room fell silent. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on Benton. He described the evening exactly, as he had during the confession. Watching Emily leave the Carter house. Reeves offering her a ride. The moment she realized they were not heading toward the football field. The panic. The struggle. And finally the wrench. When Benton reached the part about the fatal blow, his voice nearly broke. She stopped moving, he said quietly. The courtroom remained still. Across the aisle, Patricia Carter closed her eyes. Not because the story was new, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way written reports never could. The testimony continued for hours. Detail after detail reconstructing the chain of events that had hidden the truth for more than 2 decades. By the time Benton stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom felt heavier than when the day began. Because the mystery that had once seemed so distant now existed in painful clarity. Emily Carter had not vanished into the unknown. Her life had ended within minutes of leaving her own driveway. And the men responsible had spent 24 years living ordinary lives while her family waited for answers. As the trial moved toward its final arguments, one thing had become certain. The silence that once surrounded the Carter case was finally gone. And in its place stood something far stronger. The truth. A truth that had waited patiently beneath layers of time, fear, and buried evidence. A truth that had finally emerged from the ground beneath a quiet house on Birch Lane. The courtroom felt different after Carl Benton finished his testimony. Not louder. Not chaotic. Just heavier. For 24 years, the disappearance of Emily Carter had existed as a question mark. A gap in the story of Maple Hollow. A mystery that stretched across decades without a clear shape. Now that shape existed, and it was impossible to ignore. The prosecution spent the next several days reinforcing the timeline Benton had described. Witnesses moved across the stand one by one, each adding another piece to the puzzle that had finally come together after so long. The forensic anthropologist explained the skull fracture under bright courtroom lights, using diagrams to show exactly where the wrench strike had landed. The angle, the force, the location, all consistent with Benton's description. The medical examiner followed. Dr. Lena Ward spoke calmly as she described the remains recovered from the basement. Based on bone structure and dental analysis, she said, we confirmed the identity as Emily Carter. She paused briefly before continuing. The fracture to the skull would have caused rapid unconsciousness followed by death shortly thereafter. Every word echoed through the courtroom. Across the aisle, Daniel Reeves sat perfectly still. No visible reaction. No eye contact with the witnesses. Just a quiet figure staring straight ahead as the story of that night unfolded piece by piece around him. Detective Aaron Holt was called to the stand next. For him, the testimony wasn't about emotions. It was about chronology, evidence, procedure. But even so, he felt the weight of the moment when the prosecutor asked the question that had started everything. Detective Holt, what led you to reopen the Emily Carter investigation? Holt held up a photograph for the jury. The blue cassette player. Advances in forensic fingerprint analysis, he said. He explained how the fingerprint had been reprocessed decades after the original investigation, how the system had matched the print to Daniel Reeves, how that single discovery had started the chain reaction that eventually uncovered the grave beneath the basement floor. The prosecutor nodded. So, without that fingerprint, this case might still be unsolved? Holt answered honestly. It's possible. The courtroom grew quiet again, because the statement carried an unsettling implication. For more than 2 decades, the truth had been sitting inside an evidence bag on a shelf, waiting for the world to catch up. The defense took their turn after the prosecution rested. Their strategy focused on doubt, not denial, because the physical evidence was too strong for that. Instead, they focused on the moment of the fatal strike. The attorney paced slowly in front of the jury box. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this case is a tragedy. A terrible one. But tragedy does not always equal murder. He pointed toward Daniel Reeves. My client did not wake up that morning planning to kill anyone. The defense argued that the situation inside the truck had escalated unexpectedly. A frightened teenager trying to escape. 2 panicked men. A chaotic moment where a wrench was grabbed without thinking. The blow, they said, was reckless, but not intentional. Then they shifted the focus slightly. Carl Benton, the man who had admitted he was present, the man who had helped bury the body, the man who received a plea deal in exchange for testimony. Mr. Benton, the attorney said during closing arguments, has every reason to shift the blame. It was a familiar courtroom strategy. But even as the words echoed through the courtroom, many people in the audience sensed something important. Regardless of how the jury interpreted intent, one fact could not be erased. Emily Carter had died because 2 grown men made a decision to lure her into a truck. And after she died, they made another decision. They buried her. Then they lived their lives as if nothing had happened. The jury deliberation lasted less than 2 days. Those hours stretched endlessly for the Carter family. Patricia Carter sat quietly in the courthouse hallway beside her husband, hands folded in her lap, staring at the polished floor tiles. 24 years of waiting had brought them to this moment. Now, 12 strangers held the final chapter of the story. Late on the second afternoon, the courtroom doors opened again. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone stood as the jurors filed back into their seats. The foreperson held the folded paper carefully. The judge asked the formal question. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. The room felt frozen. The paper unfolded slowly. We find the defendant, Daniel Reeves, guilty of second-degree murder. A quiet gasp moved through the courtroom. Reeves did not react. But across the aisle, Patricia Carter lowered her head and began to cry silently. Not loudly. Not dramatically, Just the quiet release of grief that had waited 24 years for this moment. The judge continued reading. Guilty of concealment of a body. Guilty of obstruction of justice. 3 charges. 3 decisions. The weight of them settled over the room like a final curtain. Carl Benton's sentencing would come later under the terms of his plea agreement. But for Daniel Reeves, the outcome was already clear. The quiet neighbor who had lived across the street from the Carter family would spend the remainder of his life inside a prison cell. As the courtroom emptied slowly that evening, Detective Holt stepped outside into the cold air. Snow had begun falling again, small flakes drifting through the orange glow of the courthouse lights. He stood there for a long moment, watching them fall, because even after the verdict, something about the case still lingered in his mind. Cold cases always did. They carried echoes, reminders of how easily a life could disappear into silence, and how fragile the truth sometimes was. But this time, the silence had been broken, not by luck, not by coincidence, but by persistence. A fingerprint, a basement floor, a man who eventually ran out of secrets. And somewhere in the quiet town of Maple Hollow, beneath the snow-covered trees and empty streets, the story of Emily Carter had finally reached the ending her family had waited more than 2 decades to hear. Justice had arrived.
Late.
But undeniable. After the verdict, Maple Hollow slowly returned to something that looked like normal life. The television trucks disappeared first. Satellite dishes folded, cables were packed away, and the reporters who had filled the sidewalks outside the courthouse moved on to the next story somewhere else. But the absence of cameras did not mean the story had disappeared. In small towns, certain events become part of the local memory forever. They settle quietly into conversations, into the way people talk about a street, a house, a name. Emily Carter's story had become one of those memories. Daniel Reeves was transferred to a state correctional facility 3 weeks after the trial ended. The sentencing hearing had been brief, almost procedural compared to the emotional weight of the verdict itself. The judge spoke clearly when he delivered the sentence. For the murder of Emily Carter and the concealment of her body for more than 2 decades, this court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Reeves showed almost no visible reaction. He stood quietly beside his attorney as the words were spoken, hands folded in front of him. For many people in the courtroom, that calmness remained one of the most unsettling parts of the entire case. Not anger, not regret, just silence. Carl Benton's sentencing came later. Because he had cooperated with investigators and testified during the trial, prosecutors honored the agreement that had secured his confession. The charge was reduced to involuntary manslaughter and accessory after the fact. The sentence, 15 years in prison. When the judge read the decision, Benton lowered his head slowly. Some people in the courtroom believed he deserved more. Others believed his testimony had finally given the Carter family the truth they had waited so long to hear. Justice rarely satisfied everyone. But in this case, it had at least brought clarity. Across town, Birch Lane